A solitary cowboy purchased a silent girl from her intoxicated father, only to discover she could perceive more than sound. Texas, 1881, the closing season. The autumn sun scorched the dust deep into the timber bones of the frontier settlement. Horses whinnied, livestock bellowed, and traders haggled over prices with alcohol-soaked breath and weathered boots. The final cattle sale of the season was drawing to a close, yet a gathering still clustered around a pen where a chestnut mare trembled, her ribs jutting beneath scarred hide, flanks marked with old wounds. Silas Carrion pulled his hat low against the harsh light, quiet as always. At 35, he was a man carved by earth and solitude, seldom venturing to town except for provisions or stock. He'd noticed the mare that morning and returned as the bidding dwindled. His bootsteps echoed on the hard-packed ground as he drew near. That's when he saw her, a young woman, barely 19, positioned behind the enclosure with tangled hair clinging to her face and a dress frayed at the edges. Her bare feet were caked with grime. She remained wordless, tearless. Her gaze drifted aimlessly, as though tracking something invisible to others. Beside her stood a man clutching a bottle in one hand and a cord in the other, a rope bound not to livestock, but to her wrist. "Got a simple one right here," the drunkard shouted to anyone listening. "Born to my first woman, I reckon. She ain't speaking, can't hear nothing either, but she scrubs, prepares meals, don't give lip. Going cheap." Several men snickered grimly. Another spat into the dirt. Silas looked away. This wasn't his business. He'd come for a horse, yet something pulled at him. Not words, not pleas, just a glance. The young woman was observing him. No desperation marked her features, no begging in her posture, simply a look. Steady, calm, focused on his face. In that expression lay something he hadn't witnessed in ages. Recognition, perhaps a reflection of his own isolation. The drunk stumbled nearer. "You carrying money? Want the mare? She's part of the deal. I ain't hauling her home. Not worth the dirt beneath her feet." Silas paused. The mare pawed nervously, foam bubbling from her nostrils. The girl's stare remained fixed. He turned back, met the drunk's bloodshot eyes. "I'll purchase them both." Laughter erupted from the nearby men, harsh and mocking. "You acquiring animals or building yourself a collection, Silas?" someone hollered. Silas offered no response. He counted coins into the man's palm, sufficient for a horse, insufficient for a human soul. The man jerked the rope forward, but the girl recoiled, instinctively stepping behind Silas. "She belongs to you now," the drunk mumbled. "Don't claim I didn't caution you. Ain't worth the feed." Silas untied the cord, tossed it back. He led the mare from the pen while the girl followed with quiet, measured steps. She carried nothing save the thin wrap across her shoulders. When they reached his wagon, she stopped, waited, still silent. He opened the back and gestured for her to climb in. She did, folding herself into the corner like someone accustomed to invisibility. As he climbed onto the driver's seat, he felt the lightest touch on his coat. He glanced down. Her fingers, small, work-worn, had brushed his sleeve just once. She wasn't looking at him now. Her attention rested on distant peaks. But in that single contact, he sensed it. She hadn't thanked him, hadn't pleaded, yet in that moment she had chosen to place her trust in him. Silas Carrion, who conversed more with horses than humans, who dwelled alone on 200 acres of red Texas earth, with fences for companions and wounds he never discussed. Now with a girl who couldn't hear, a girl who might comprehend more than anyone had ever imagined. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding over the hard-pan trail leading from town. Behind him, the girl sat huddled beneath a blanket, face turned toward the breeze. She never glanced back, neither did he. The journey to home. The wagon rolled through twilight and dust, winding between rolling hills and scattered brush, until the fields expanded and the sky opened into Texas vastness. Silas's spread wasn't impressive, just a main dwelling with a tilted roof, several outbuildings, and a long expanse of grassland where cattle wandered under endless sky. But it was peaceful, orderly, and for a man like him, it had always sufficed, until this moment. He assisted the girl down from the wagon, uncertain whether she'd flee or freeze, but she stepped gracefully to the earth, her eyes surveying the land. Not fearful, just alert, as if memorizing everything without seeking permission. Inside the kitchen, Silas fed the fire and indicated the kettle. She nodded and moved toward it without hesitation, locating the tin cups and ladle, as if she'd always belonged near flame and hunger. Still, she produced no sound. After the evening meal, he handed her chalk from the cupboard and tapped the wooden door frame beside the table. "Name," he said slowly. She studied him for a long moment, then knelt beside the frame. With careful fingers, she traced a single name in soft, flowing letters. Emmeline. He read it once, then again. "Emmeline," he repeated aloud, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. She gave no smile, but she turned and walked into the darkened barn. Communication beyond words. The following morning, Silas discovered her in the stable, crouched beside the same battered mare. The horse had barely eaten since the auction, its hind legs swollen from old injury. Emmeline ran a damp cloth along the mare's side, speaking with her hands. Not words, not gestures, just the careful rhythm of someone who listened with her palms and her breathing. Silas stood in the barn entrance, arms crossed. He'd seen experienced ranch hands get kicked for less, but the mare remained still, trembling only slightly, allowing the girl to wrap its leg with patient care. Perhaps she couldn't hear, but she certainly understood. That day, Silas assigned her tasks, simple ones: scrub the floors, heat water, clean the tack room. She completed them without protest, without asking, without a single sound. Each evening he left chalk for her, and she would scribble notes in the margins of their world. Salt running low, dog favoring left paw, air smells of storm coming. They never conversed, but the quietness didn't feel hollow. The tempest until the storm arrived. It began like most Texas storms, gradual and deceptive. A warm wind rose at sunset, rustling through the tall grass like a whispered warning. Silas glanced at the sky, noticed clouds gathering in the distance, but dismissed it. He was in the cattle shelter when she appeared. Emmeline, barefoot, wild-haired, breathing quick but soundless. She grabbed his sleeve and pulled firmly. "What is it?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands shaking. Her eyes conveyed what her voice could not. "Take cover." He hesitated halfway through examining a sick calf, but something in her expression spurred him into action. She tugged again, toward the barn door, away from the corral. Then it struck. A crack. No, a splitting. The world divided as lightning descended from the heavens, striking the tree that towered behind the cattle shelter. The blast shook the ground beneath them. Sparks scattered. The tree erupted in flames and crashed with a groan that sounded like the sky mourning. Silas staggered backward. The calves bleated in terror. Smoke spiraled skyward. He looked at her. Emmeline stood motionless just outside the doorway, her face illuminated by the dancing fire, eyes steady, chest heaving. She had known, not guessed, not sensed. She had known before thunder, before the atmosphere shifted. Silas walked toward her, slowly, still half in shock. "How did you—" But she only looked at him, silent, certain. That night, after the fire was extinguished and the animals calmed, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. No chalk this time, no words, just a man with his hands on the wood and a girl who could not speak. Yet somehow she had heard something no one else could. Not thunder, not wind, but the warning within the world itself. Silas realized for the first time in years he wasn't alone. He looked at her hands folded in her lap. "Emmeline," he said again. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Silence answered, and it was sufficient. The blessing of comprehension. Since the storm, Silas had begun to observe more closely, not with suspicion, but with the quiet wonder of a man who had lived too long in isolation and now found himself witnessing something he could not explain and perhaps did not wish to. Emmeline never spoke. She never signed, never wrote much beyond her name. She possessed no books, no formal education, no vocabulary. Yet there were days when it seemed she understood more than anyone he had ever encountered. One morning, when the lead cow stood isolated in the pasture, refusing to eat, Silas attributed it to the chill. He made a mental note to monitor her, but Emmeline, she moved without question. She brought straw to the birthing stall, drew water infused with mint leaves from the well, and stood beside the cow, stroking her belly in slow, deliberate circles. By evening, the cow was in labor. She had known. Somehow she had known. Silas said nothing, but he observed her. That night he couldn't sleep. The next day he attempted again. He returned from town with tension in his shoulders, the burden of old history weighing on his spirit. The sheriff had spoken in riddles and warnings about land claims, rumors that his father had seized more than was rightfully his during the war. Bloodshed, displacement, guilt. None of it was fresh, but it never ceased to sting. He spoke no word of it to Emmeline, but when he sat on the front steps, gazing into the gathering dusk, she came and stood beside him. She did not speak. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder. After a long moment, Silas murmured, "How did you know that I carry shame about this land? Shame about what my father did to secure it?" Emmeline's dark eyes searched his. Then slowly she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest, directly over his heart. After that, she turned and walked toward the old oak where his father's grave lay silent under the Texas sky. She had never read the stone, never posed questions, yet she knew. At night, Silas tossed in bed, sweating through dreams of cannon fire and scorched hills. His father's voice emerged through the smoke, rough, proud, trembling. "I gave you the land, Silas, and I gave you the blood upon it." Silas woke with a jolt, his breathing loud in the stillness. And then he saw her. Emmeline sat in a chair by the hearth. She had lit a single candle. In the flickering light, her profile appeared carved from shadow and grace. On the table beside the candle lay a blue handkerchief, faded, trimmed with hand-stitched lace. His mother's. Silas hadn't seen it in a decade. It had been locked away in a cedar chest no one else touched. He sat up. "How dash?" Emmeline didn't look at him. She rose without a sound and walked to the door. She didn't need to explain. She had heard something no one else could. Not words, not memories, but pain, grief. The silent weight of guilt pressed between ribs. The aching sound of a man's heart breaking when he was too proud to let it be heard. And in her quietness, she responded. She heard. And for the first time in Silas's life, he feared. Not for his land, nor his legacy, nor even his soul. He feared losing the one person who knew what he felt before he ever spoke a word. Rising suspicion. The first murmur came from the blacksmith's wife. "She stares too intently at the livestock," she said, folding breadcloths under the porch, voice low but cutting as wire, like she knows which one will perish next. By week's end, it was the preacher's son who added fuel to the fire. "She touched our goat," he told a circle of eager ears, "and 2 days later it birthed too early. That ain't natural." No one had ever heard Emmeline speak, and the fewer words she offered, the more the town seemed eager to fill the silence for her, with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her child behind her when Emmeline passed by, though she only came to purchase flour. At the post, someone spat near her feet. Most days she kept her head lowered. She never flinched, but Silas saw how her fingers gripped tighter around the basket in her arms and how her footsteps became softer, as if trying to vanish from ground that refused to forget. He did not mention it to her, and she never asked why the world could not bear to witness quiet kindness. But one afternoon, when a ranch hand's boy came down with a burning fever, red-faced and convulsing in his sleep, it was not the physician who came. It was Emmeline. She moved softly into the barn where the child lay. She did not seek permission. She merely knelt beside the cot, placed a hand on the boy's chest, then his forehead, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she walked outside, cut 3 types of herbs from Silas's drying wall, lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco, and returned with a hot cloth. The boy drank the steeped leaves in silence. By sunrise, he was sitting up, hungry again. His mother wept, held Emmeline's hand with trembling gratitude. But the next day she could be heard whispering at the well. She did not ask what the boy's symptoms were. How did she know? How did she know? The fear was no longer whispered. The confrontation. 3 days later they arrived with torches, not lit, but carried like threats. 8 men and women, boots stirring up dust, stood at the gate of Silas's ranch. The eldest among them, Mr. Withers, a man whose own daughter had not spoken to him in years, stepped forward. "We want her gone," he said. "That girl hears things she shouldn't." Silas stood in the barn's doorway, arms folded across his chest. He had not shaved in days, and his face was hard as the timber framing behind him. "She's mute," he said. "That ain't the same as deaf," Withers snapped. "She sees what's coming before the sky even changes. She communicates with animals like they respond. A steer of mine died last week, and she was the only one who touched it. You think she cursed it? I think she's cursed, period." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside the house, Emmeline stood behind the curtain. She had heard the gravel shift under their boots. She had seen their faces twisted, not with hatred, but something worse. Conviction. She moved to open the door, but Silas held up a hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly in the thawing mud, and faced them directly. "She saved a child's life. Maybe she's the one who gave him the fever in the first place," a woman spat. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She is the only person I know who truly listens," he said, "not with ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her entire soul." The crowd stilled. "I have lived 35 years, he continued, voice low but unwavering, "and I can count on one hand the number of people who truly heard me. Not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief." And she did, without uttering a single thing. He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping over them. "You want to drive someone away for being different? For seeing the world you're too frightened to face? Fine, but you'll have to go through me." Withers opened his mouth, then closed it. No one moved. Then slowly the crowd dispersed, torches unused, boots heavy. That night the ranch was silent except for the wind. Inside, Emmeline placed a pot of warm cider on the fire, then moved beside Silas at the table. She did not sign, did not write, did not even look at him. But after a moment she reached out, rested her fingers on his hand. It was not gratitude, it was recognition. He turned his palm upward, curled his fingers gently around hers, and together in the stillness, they listened to the crackle of the wood, the hush of the night, and the bond growing between two souls that never needed words to communicate. Winter's embrace. The first snowfall of December arrived quiet and slow, like someone laying down a blanket over all that had burned or broken. Emmeline stood by the window of the log kitchen, her fingers threading a needle through scraps of old fabric. Leather patches, wool cuffs, the lining from an old coat Silas no longer wore. She was crafting a cloak, not for herself, but for him. She did not need to hear the wind to know the cold was approaching. Silas observed her from the barn door. She moved with intention, every motion deliberate. She had no words, but in the weeks since the townspeople had turned away and he had chosen to keep her there, his world had found rhythm again. She brewed coffee every morning before the sky turned gray. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles. She brushed the horses in slow circles and trained the yearlings using gestures no cowboy had ever thought to attempt. He had never seen animals respond that way to someone. She would stand motionless, just long enough for a skittish foal to inch closer. Then she'd raise a single hand, slow and open, and wait. And somehow always they listened. The silence around the ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. The accident. One late afternoon, Silas rode out toward the ridge, checking the fences before the storm they both knew was coming. The light had just begun to dim when his horse startled. A loose rock, maybe, or a scent on the wind, and reared. He was thrown hard, landing shoulder first on frozen earth. The breath rushed from his chest. For a moment, he could not feel anything but the throbbing pulse of pain where his arm struck a jutting root. He staggered to his feet, bleeding from the elbow. The sky was deepening fast. He wrapped a cloth around the wound and tried to walk, but each step sent sharp pain through his ribs. When he stumbled into the yard, the last light had faded. Emmeline burst from the cabin before he could knock. She had sensed it, or perhaps she had just known, one of those strange, uncanny instincts of hers that no one could explain. She helped him inside, sat him down by the hearth, and peeled the cloth from his wound with gentle fingers. Her brow furrowed as she worked. She brought water, cleaned the gash, and pressed a paste of yarrow and pine sap against it. He watched her. "You always know," he whispered. She met his eyes. Then, without warning, she lifted his hand to her face, then pressed her lips, soft, warm, against the edge of the wound. Silas stilled. The fire cracked, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Emmeline did not speak. She did not smile, but something passed between them, like a door opening in the quiet. Later, as the storm rolled in and snow dusted the window panes, Silas sat across from her at the table. He had taken a piece of paper from his desk drawer and written slowly, carefully, each letter shaped with meaning that could not be spoken aloud. He turned it to face her. "I want to hear your heart," it read, "if you'll let me listen with mine." She looked at the words for a long time, then her fingers reached out and touched them one by one, as if to feel the truth inside the ink. When she finally raised her eyes, they were wet, but not from sorrow. She reached across the table and touched his chest. Just once. Just enough. And then, for the first time since she had entered his life, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of fear or thanks, but a smile like sunrise, like something breaking free after being held in too long. Outside, the wind howled, but inside that cabin, a silence deeper than words had found its voice, and it was warm, and it was real. Learning each other. The days softened. Winter still gripped the ridges, but between storms, life returned slowly. So did something else, something quiet and steady between Silas and Emmeline. She taught him sign language. Water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like branches in the wind, and though he fumbled, she never laughed, only touched his hands, guiding them until he got it. He taught her to ride. She had never sat a saddle before. The first time she clung to the horn, knuckles white, but he walked beside her, speaking low. Though she could not hear, she moved with the horse anyway, sensing its rhythm through her bones. They built a small room off the cabin, part shelter, part refuge. There they shared meals in silence by the fire. They did not need words. Their glances said more than language could. He noticed things. She smiled when birds gathered at dusk. She flinched at sudden pops in the fire. She always knew a storm before it came. One night he spelled a sentence in shaky signs. "You make this place complete." She stared, then touched her fingers to his lips. Not a kiss, just a thank you. A way of saying, "I hear you too." The storm that changed everything. Then came the storm. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire after repairing fences all day. The sky had been calm, no warning. The lantern flickered low. He woke to her hand on his shoulder. "Emmeline." She pulled his coat and pointed toward the barn. Outside, the wind had shifted. Clouds raced past the moon. The air felt wrong, electric. In the barn, the horses thrashed. Emmeline moved through them like wind, touching each flank, calm and certain. A loud creak overhead. Silas looked up. A beam splintered. "We need to move them!" he shouted, but she was already leading the mare out, signing fast. "Roof will collapse, now!" Together they moved the horses to the shelter near the house. Rain hit the roof like fists, just as the last animal cleared the door. The north beam gave way. The roof crashed where they had just stood. Silas turned. Emmeline stood watching the barn collapse. Hair soaked, chest rising. He looked at her. Truly looked. She was still grounded, a part of the wind and rain, not separate from it. "How did you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed to the sky. He understood. She felt it. Later in the cabin, he handed her a blanket and sat beside her. He took her hand and spelled, "You belong to this land." She smiled, then placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. And for the first time, he felt her rhythm, quiet, steady. She did not hear like others. She heard deeper, and Silas, in that moment, knew he had finally been heard too. Changing hearts. The wind that once carried whispers now brought footsteps, hesitant, then trusting. Something had shifted in the town beyond Silas's fences. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in silence, as most real change begins. The first was Tom Weaver, a ranch hand with a torn shoulder. The doctor was out east and no one else knew how to wrap a wound right. He arrived one gray morning, reins in one hand, the other arm limp. Silas spotted him from the porch. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom nodded past him to where Emmeline was kneeling by the herb patch. "Heard she fixes things. Quietly." Silas gave a slow nod. "She does." Emmeline came without a word. She examined the arm, her hands steady, her brow creased in thought. She moved as if listening, not to words, but to something deeper. When she pressed the right spot, Tom winced, then sighed. 2 days later, a widow came. She had not slept in weeks. Emmeline sat with her at dusk, hands gently resting on her shoulders, until the shaking stopped. The next morning, the woman returned with a pie and a hand-knit scarf. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." That winter passed with fewer raised voices, fewer names spat in fear. Silas and Emmeline lived as before, quietly, but now passing townspeople tipped their hats. Some left preserves by the gate. The lost boy. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. The frost had just lifted. The church bell rang, and before its echo faded, panic spread. A 7-year-old boy had vanished from his family during morning chores. One boot was found near the tree line. Nothing more. Men shouted, mothers cried, dogs barked. When Silas and Emmeline heard, he reached for his coat. Emmeline, already beside him, placed a hand on his arm. Then she knelt. She pressed her hands to the earth, palms, wrists, her whole forearm. Then she crawled forward, pausing, tracing subtle marks. A shifted pebble, a broken twig. She stood and walked. He did not look back, but they followed. Silas, then Tom, then others. Through thickets, up ridges, down dry creek beds, until in a cedar-ringed clearing they saw him. The boy curled beneath a bent tree, his ankle swollen, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Emmeline ran. She knelt, checked his leg, brushed hair from his eyes. Then she looked up at Silas, not proud, not triumphant, just relieved. When the boy was safe and the story retold, no one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who hears with her heart. The passing years. The wind moved slowly that evening, brushing gently over the tall grass, like it remembered every name that had ever been whispered on this land. Years had passed. The ranch still stood, weathered, wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a life not hurried. Silas walked a little slower now, and Emmeline's hair had grown long and silver-threaded. But neither of them kept track of years and numbers. They counted time in seasons, in moments held quietly between two hands. In the soundless way a heart says, "I'm still here." The children came most mornings, from the town, from the edge of the hills, from places where words were often thrown too fast or forgotten too easily. Here they found something else. They learned to listen, not with ears, but with their whole being. They sat with Emmeline in the garden as she taught them how to know the difference between fear and shyness in the twitch of a rabbit's nose. They stood beside her in the stable and watched her place a single hand on a horse's flank, calming it with nothing but her breath. She did not teach with rules. She taught with silence, and with the rare, precious way she smiled when they understood something without having to say it out loud. Silas built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. That's where they sat most evenings, he and Emmeline, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun settle into the hills. On those evenings, neither spoke much. They didn't have to. He would pour 2 mugs of tea still warm from the kettle, and she would take his hand, thumb tracing a slow rhythm across the back of it. Sometimes he would bring out an old harmonica and play a tune with no name, and she would close her eyes and sway as if she could feel the song ripple through the dusk. A voice at last. Then one evening, as shadows stretched across the wheat field and a hush fell over the trees, Emmeline turned to him. She had learned a little speech over the years, not much, just enough to read lips and shape a few careful words. Most days she still preferred her hands, but this time she spoke with her voice. A voice not used to being heard, soft as a leaf falling in snow. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Silas blinked. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded gently, his throat tightened as he answered, "I hear you. Always have." They stayed like that until the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, a new group of children arrived. Emmeline wrote a sentence in chalk across the wooden slate nailed beside the front door. She did it every morning, like a ritual. Today it read, "The day will be kind. I feel it." No one asked how she knew. They just believed her. And when the old folks in town talked about the girl who once could not speak or hear, they did not whisper the word witch anymore. They called her the one who listens with her heart. Some still shook their heads in doubt, but most just smiled or nodded or came by with a pie and stayed long enough to leave with something gentler in their chest. Forever love. The final scene of the year found Silas and Emmeline walking together through the pasture. The sky was wide, brushed with amber and lilac. Their steps were slow, steady. A mare and her foal grazed nearby. The world was quiet but never empty. They stopped at the top of the hill. Emmeline turned to him and, for the first time, laughed. Not a loud sound, but a ripple of air that shook her shoulders and lit her face like dawn. Silas smiled and kissed her temple. No one told their story. It didn't need to be told because it was still happening. And sometimes the truest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the kind that walks beside you in silence every day and never asks to be anything more than real. If your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood without words, if you believe that love does not need a voice to be heard, only a soul brave enough to feel, then the story of Silas and Emmeline was meant for you. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak in the same tongue, a lonely rancher and a girl the world called deaf discovered a language deeper than sound, a language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If stories of love that endure through prejudice, pain, and unspoken grace speak to you, subscribe to the Wild West Folks channel. Here, love is not just told, it's remembered, it's reclaimed, and it echoes long after the last word fades. We'll see you again in the next story. Until then, may your quiet moments be full, and may someone always hear the heart you carry.